Welcome to Chapter 7, our chapter on thinking and intelligence. In this chapter, we're going to learn about various types of thinking and some of the problematic styles that we may, once we've learned more about them, be better able to avoid. We're also going to learn about the concept of intelligence and find that within psychology, there's not one unified accepted theory of intelligence, so we'll have to turn to various experts to see how they conceptualize intelligence. And we'll also get a glimpse of intelligence from a cross-cultural perspective, which I think you'll find very interesting. And we'll even take a very short glimpse at animal intelligence. So let's begin. Please read this definition of thinking to yourself. It certainly is a thorough but lengthy definition. Perhaps let's think about retrieval cues and transform this into a gist. Let's consider this definition of thinking. Thinking is the mental manipulation of information. So for example, let's say a new teacher pulls a definition out of the textbook and plunks it on a PowerPoint. That did not require thinking. It was not the mental manipulation of information. It was just moving it from one location to the next. Let's say the teacher reads it aloud in class from the PowerPoint. Students record it in their notebooks again, just recording it, just moving from place to place. And even if you memorize it as is and then put it back on the test, have you really manipulated it? Have you interacted with it? Have you changed it? Really? No, you haven't. Contrast that to maybe a student who is looking at the definition of thinking and combines that with the way thinking was viewed in a different sort of class, maybe adds to it, maybe questions it, and somehow changes it. That is thinking. Earlier in the class, when we were learning the different branches of psychology, you might remember that we discussed cognitive psychology. And at that point, we learned a new vocabulary word, cognition, thinking. Given that, I'm quite sure that you have no trouble filling the blank in the bottom of the page. On the previous slide, which did not have audio, we learned that thinking occurs in all four lobes. This slide has a little review activity, so please jot down the correct answer, or at least the one that you believe to be correct, for each of these questions, and then check your answer on the next slide. Is any part of the brain more important to thinking than others? Yes, actually the frontal lobe. It is more important for both conscious thinking and intuition. Think of intuition as unconscious thought. You might say sometimes, my gut tells me. Really, we're saying my intuition, my non-conscious thought is trying to tell me. In some cultures, people listen more or less to their intuition. Our culture, we tend to listen to our intuition less. But sometimes it is vital. If you're ever in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, feeling not right, get yourself out of the situation, not necessarily even being polite. If you really think that something is wrong, do remove yourself from that situation. It's okay. Think of the slide, perhaps. Think of your safety always. Let's consider the concept of schema. In class, I use the sports car schema as an example, but let's start with a different example first. Pretend you take all your possessions that fit easily inside your house and throw them in a big pile on the floor. Then I ask you to organize them. You might pull out clothing and throw it into one pile, and then your makeup articles, if you use makeup, in a different pile, and your pots and pans in a different pile, and even your food in a different pile. So each pile is organized, and it's rather like a schema. Now let's say we want to organize it. Maybe you would put your cans on a shelf. You'd put your clothes on a hanger. So schemas would take that disarray of items and organize them. Similarly, in our brains, our knowledge is organized, and it's organized not into shelves or to hangers, but it's organized into schemas. In class, we would do the sports car schema, and I would ask students to write the word sports car in their notes and then write down everything that comes to mind. And often they would come up with fast, expensive, small, or shiny, usually not all of those in the class, but many. I'd also get other suggestions. Red, two-door, fast iOS add-on ticket magnet, and so on. So the schema organizes our knowledge on a particular topic. Now consider perhaps the most important schema of all in your life, the schema of you. In class, I ask my students to write down everything that defines them. You can take this wherever you want to, but I would ask you that you actually try this. It might help to actually learn about yourself as well as the concept of schema. So it can be anything. What defines you, what makes you as a person, what are your passions, everything that is essential to defining you. So go for it in maybe 30 seconds. Write down everything that comes to mind. This is a schema I found on the internet. It might have a few of the same items that you have on your own schema. You might see that there are personality traits listed. Students often list personality traits, often physical descriptors, hobbies and passions, also family relationships, maybe culture, demographic characteristics like your national origin, race and ethnicity. When you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the things that students have shared with me in the past. Did you list your role as a student? I'm always surprised when students don't list this first and foremost. Isn't that part of the defining feature of where you are right now in your life? Probably. Part of life is facing and solving many problems. When looking at the word problem, you might think of the current COVID-19 virus situation. And it indeed is a serious problem, both individual, family, societal, and world. We have faced as human species much bigger viral attacks or epidemics than this one. For example, to maybe give us a historical perspective, the Black Plague taking place in the middle 1300s killed 50 million people. That was 60% of all Europeans. If you consider more modern times, the Great Influenza outbreak of 1918, it killed 1/5 of the entire world's population. That was significantly more than died in World War I. Humans have faced many viruses in the past, and the coronavirus has a mortality rate of about 1%, which means we should take all proper steps, including social distancing of 6 feet and vigorous hand washing. But to keep in historical perspective, it is a virus that is actually not nearly as significant or severe, at least biologically, than the ones we have faced as a species before. I don't know if that helps at all, but I just wanted to share that little bit of information that I learned myself. Let's focus on problem-solving strategies. On this slide, we're going to look at 3 different strategies, that of trial and error, algorithms, and heuristics. Trial and error is sometimes the best strategy to go. Looking at the picture at the right of the keys, let's say that you're trying to find a particular key and you don't know which one. Well, try one. If that works, great. Try the next one and keep going until you either solve it or you give up. Sometimes that is the best way to go. Now, algorithms, on the other hand, are very different. As you can see, there are a series of steps which are guaranteed to get you to a correct solution. In class, I ask students, if I give them the word algorithm, what does it make them think of, what particular academic area? And they'll often say math or computers. Exactly, because algorithms are used in both of those disciplines. So if a computer is given a correct algorithm, as long as there is an answer out there, the computer will solve it. So they guarantee a correct solution. But many times humans do not use algorithms. They take a lot more effort. As humans, we like heuristics. And maybe think of it as a mnemonic, H is for human, H is heuristic, so you don't get the term algorithm mixed up with heuristic. Heuristics usually work. There's what's worked in the past, shortcuts, rules of thumb. So if they work quickly, but they don't always work. On the next slide will be just 3 examples and see if you can figure out which is example of the trial and error strategy, the algorithm, and the heuristic. I think you'll do it very easily. So first, reading the manual, definitely an example of using an algorithm. It will work as long as you read it properly and apply it. In class, I always ask my students, oh, which of you always use the manual? And usually I get 1 or 2, 3 students will raise their hand. The rest of us often try to avoid manuals whenever possible. I ask those 2 or 3 or 4 students to share why they use manuals. Fire technology and aviation students often give me a similar answer. It could be the difference between life and death. A second example, that would definitely be trial and error. And the third one, definitely an example of a very human way of doing it, the heuristic. Go ahead and jot these 4 different types of heuristics into your notes, and on the next slides we'll be talking about them individually. Let's consider the heuristic of working backwards. Let's pretend that you have a task that is overwhelming you with anxiety, maybe the construction of a paper for a particular teacher, and you can't get yourself started. Well, maybe picture the task from the back moving forward. Perhaps the last thing you would do would be to do your reference page. And if you have your sources at this point and a format guide, well then go ahead and construct a reference page. You now have the last task done, and you probably could feel your anxiety levels drop precipitously. When I always did a paper, the second to the last thing I did was the title page. So maybe do your title page. And again, you can maybe feel your anxiety drop a little bit more. So either by doing the task backwards or even visualizing it backwards, you might get that certain task started. So if you mentally yelled out to the previous slide, life is like a box of chocolate, indeed a famous quote, or indeed a famous metaphor, made even more famous by Forrest Gump. Sometimes using metaphors will help to clarify your thinking. If you were confused and thought, well, isn't that a simile? Well, you are right. It is both a simile and a metaphor. Similes are subtypes of metaphors. Similes will use the word like. Life is like a box of chocolate. Metaphors and simile are both comparisons, but a metaphor does not use necessarily the word like. Consider the famous Shakespearean quote, "All the world is a stage, and the men and women are merely players." So that's also comparing men and women to being on a stage. Life basically is like a stage, though it did not use the word like. And if you want to make this a little bit more complex, analogies are in the same ballpark, and many students and faculty get similes and metaphors and analogies mixed up. Analogies take it further. Analogies want to explain, and analogies want to apply. Maybe even as a mnemonic, think of as analogies want to analyze. For example, if you're told, stop beating a dead horse, it is suggested that you apply that and stop your particular labors on a situation. It is not going to be fruitful. Or consider another famous analogy. No sense rearranging your chairs on the Titanic, meaning, again, future work in this area is not going to yield any fruitful gain, suggesting that you apply that and ceasing your behavior. So maybe that's also clarified metaphor, simile, and analogy. And could I ask that on a test? Well, probably. So quite probably. Another useful heuristic is breaking a big problem into smaller problems. So a student facing a report card, though we don't call that anymore. Another heuristic for solving problems would be breaking the problem into smaller problems. Let's say that a student at the midterm grade point is noting difficulties in all or most of their classes. So instead of looking at the big problem of unsuccessful performance, maybe break it into individual ones, each specific area, and tackle from there. So perhaps a student would next contact individual teachers who are still available over the break, contact success coaches who are also still available over the break, and so on. So many times a big overwhelming problem is much more tackleable, if that's a word, by breaking into smaller tasks that can be successfully challenged. So a very effective heuristic can be breaking a big problem into smaller ones. So if you're doing poorly in all your classes, look at each individually and go from there. So look at the syllabus, look at if you're completing the assignments on time. If you are, talk to each teacher, talk to the success coaches. So you might need to make different adjustments in different classes, but this problem at first class, which might be insurmountable, might be quite tackleable. But don't wait to midterms. As soon as you have trouble in any class, get help at that point. We're all here to help you, and we all want you to succeed. I'm sure you either thought to yourself COVID-19 or its alternate name, the coronavirus. Last year, of course, we did not hear that example. Last year, HIV was a very common example. Computer viruses, such as maybe the Trojan, or the virus shown in that poor baby in the bottom right. Do you remember what virus that would be? That would be the Zika virus. So in this task, you're asked to list the first virus that came to your mind. You are actually using one of our heuristics on our first PowerPoint. That was the availability heuristic. So again, the availability heuristic is just choosing whatever answer, whatever choice comes to your mind first. So if you mentally yelled out to the previous slide, life is like a box of chocolate, indeed, a famous quote, or indeed a famous metaphor, made even more famous by Forrest Gump. Sometimes using metaphors will help to clarify your thinking. If you were confused and thought, well, isn't that a simile? Well, you are right. It is both a simile and a metaphor. Similes are subtypes of metaphors. Similes will use the word like. Life is like a box of chocolate. Metaphors and simile are both comparisons, but a metaphor does not use necessarily the word like. Consider the famous Shakespearean quote, "All the world is a stage, and the men and women are merely players." So that's also comparing men and women to being on a stage. Life basically is like a stage, though it did not use the word like. And if you want to make this a little bit more complex, analogies are in the same ballpark, and many students and faculty get similes and metaphors and analogies mixed up. Analogies take it further. Analogies want to explain, and analogies want to apply. Maybe even as a mnemonic, think of as analogies want to analyze. For example, if you're told, stop beating a dead horse, it is suggested that you apply that and stop your particular labors on a situation. It is not going to be fruitful. Or consider another famous analogy. No sense rearranging your chairs on the Titanic, meaning, again, future work in this area is not going to yield any fruitful gain, suggesting that you apply that and ceasing your behavior. So maybe that's also clarified metaphor, simile, and analogy. And could I ask that on a test? Well, probably. So quite probably. In thinking, we use prototypes, exemplars, and stereotypes. A prototype is the best example of something. So if I ask you regarding apples, not your favorite type, but which apple captures appleness the best, which is the appliest of all apples, a student might say Red Delicious or Granny Smith. Whatever you think is the best example of a certain category is a prototype. Now let's consider dogs. If I'd ask you not what type of dog you own or what dog you prefer, but what dog captures dogitude the best, some students will say German Shepherds or Pit Bulls, which would be the best answer, by the way, or Chihuahuas or Shelties. Whatever you say would be your prototype. Now, when you're done with the slide, look at the dog on the next slide. I have never had a student list this particular dog as their prototype. And yes, the hair naturally goes that way, and this is actually a very good quality one of this particular breed. Do you know this breed? Probably not. You'll see a Chinese crested on the next slide. The word exemplar is just a fancy term for the word example. So if your prototype dog was a German Shepherd, and if we were in class, the person next to you had said Chihuahua, and the person on the other side of them said Beagle, their answers for you would have been exemplars. Now, in thinking, sometimes we'll also use stereotypes. Stereotypes allow for quick, easy thinking, but risk being inaccurate. I wanted to first tackle a stereotype that applies to dogs. For example, the dog stereotype, most pit bulls are dangerous. So when asked what dog is the doggiest of all dogs, in your personal opinion, not the dog that you own or the dog that you want to own, but the dog that best exemplifies dogitude the best, in other words, we're asking you for a prototype. And this little guy probably is not going to come to very many people's example of the dog prototype. Do you have any idea what type of dog this is? And the hair growth that you see, the lack of coat on the body, the long, luxurious hair in the mane and lower legs. I did have one student once who did know it. This is a Chinese crested. It's a breed I find very interesting, but I would not want to own. They're very high maintenance. You have to have coats and even moderately cool weather, sunscreen, and so on. But again, back to our example, probably not your example of a dog prototype. Chances are, though, for many of you, one of the dogs on the next slide could be your prototype example. Unless you said a pit bull or a Jack Russell or a golden retriever, these would be exemplars of dogs. Now let's continue with the stereotype that most pit bulls are dangerous. I'm not sure if you're familiar with human face transplants, but there have been a few. The first woman to ever have a face transplant has in a very bad stretch in her life, and she decided to commit suicide. She decided to take pills. But after she became unconscious, she was awoken by the extreme pain that she was in. Her dog, for some unknown reason, decided to literally eat her face. When she reached medical help, she was missing her nose fully and most of her lips. If you're going to look at stereotypes, which of these four breeds would you think would be the most likely to have been the doer of this dastardly deed? Would it be the pit bull, the yellow lab, the German shepherd, or maybe a Rottie? Now, as you might suspect, it would be the animal probably least likely in this grouping to be picked, the yellow lab. Now, if you're curious to see what this woman looked like, there's some pictures of her on the next slide. The first picture is when she's had many surgeries and her face is looking much more normal. On the right, her face looks, I think, very excellent considering the degree of injury. If you want to see how bad it was originally, you can go ahead and look around the internet, but the original pictures immediately afterwards were extremely graphic, and I would not necessarily recommend them. So to conclude, if you utilize a stereotype, the stereotype, as it often does in life, would lead you to an incorrect answer.